Is the RAM shortage over? I am pretty confident about my opinion on this matter, but before you dismiss my opinion as some kid yapping in his bedroom, I need to tell you who I am. I have actually worked in the PC industry for about 5 years at this point. And at some point for 2 years, I was the head of a tech retail startup selling PC parts here in Singapore, a serious actual business I'll link below. We sold over $2 million worth of PC parts across 2.5 years, and it is a business that's still going. I just don't work there anymore. I also run a YouTube channel where I've talked about, reviewed, and checked out PC related things across 10 years. So, is the RAM shortage over? I think the answer pretty confidently is no. It will improve for a little bit, possibly, but I think overall in the long term, it's going to stay quite high in terms of prices. It's still going to stay quite low in terms of supply, and it's still going to be a while before the consumer side of RAM things kind of get to a more acceptable level. But even then, I think it'll still be quite elevated. So why do people think that the RAM shortage is over? Skip this part if you already know why people are starting to think that the RAM shortage might be fixed. But it basically obviously all boils down to AI, because the RAM shortage occurred because of all the AI servers gobbling up the RAM supplies in the world to run these huge, massive data centers with large language models to train the AI models as well as run them and have all the context and parameters and data sets and data points that they need to function and keep improving and keep growing. And for a while now, one of the biggest bottlenecks to AI getting bigger, getting more performant, getting faster and growing is the availability of RAM. There's just not enough of them, which is why a lot of manufacturers of RAM, the biggest manufacturers, Micron, SK Hynix, and Samsung, have basically almost fully pivoted into really only manufacturing RAM for the AI chips out there, the faster RAMs that you find on your GPUs, your MPUs, and all these servers. That means very little supply for us plebs who are just looking to buy RAM for a gaming PC or looking to buy a GPU with RAM on it, because it's all being eaten up by the really rich, really powerful AI people who are just eating up all the supply with their much greater pockets. That's why the shortage has occurred. Now, recently though, Google released a paper regarding a new feature, a new kind of thing called TurboQuant, which uses really smart mathematics, which I don't fully understand, I have to be honest, to basically increase the efficiency of RAM usage by AI, large language models, or actually on AI models as a whole, by, from what I heard, about 600% without a loss in quality and output. At least that's what the paper claims. This has basically driven the whole market into a panic. We don't need that much RAM anymore, and the stock prices for like RAM companies have just plummeted and crashed. And honestly, by today, it's already started to pick back up. And I've seen a lot of reactionary posts from influencers and whatever, and people who didn't really look too much into the matter saying, oh, is the RAM shortage over? And while I love optimism, this is not exactly a piece of news that really changes the game to make me feel particularly optimistic. The first reason is that all these AI companies are pushing hard to scale these models as big as possible. They're trying to hit AGI. They're trying to basically make a god AI that can do everything. If you give them an opportunity to 6 times the output with the same amount of RAM, they're not going to use 6 times less RAM. They're just going to use the same amount of RAM they were always going to use, but now with 6 times more effectiveness, and they will move to their goals maybe a bit faster and with a little less bottleneck on the RAM side. They're not going to buy less RAM because the money they have spent and put into orders for RAM, it's still there. The backlog for all these like high-end RAM chips for AI is still insane and still far outstrips the demand a consumer can provide. On top of that, this doesn't seem to me like, oh, great, you don't need that much RAM anymore. It just seems to me like, oh great, you can do 6 times as many things with the same resources that you previously had, which just incentivizes companies to spend even more on getting more RAM, because now for every dollar they spend on RAM, they have 6 times the amount of leverage. So the first reason is that it's not going to incentivize less RAM usage. It's just going to make these models more powerful, which is going to incentivize more spending to grow them even more and get them even to a greater, higher level. And the bubble is still going, the money is still circulating, the backlog orders are still there, they're not going to change, which means the shortage will absolutely continue. And the second reason, which is the fundamental reasons that will make the shortage worse, those are not going away. And obviously I'm talking about things like the Iran war. One of the biggest shortages to making enough RAM chips was raw materials, in particular things like helium, which was already on a massive shortage before the Iran war. And helium is a byproduct, from what I understand, from liquid natural gas production, LNG. And one of the biggest manufacturers of helium and LNG in the world is Qatar, which now is struggling to ship any of those gases out thanks to the Iran war, the Strait of Hormuz basically being almost fully closed, which is why you have manufacturers like Samsung and SK Hynix looking to diversify their resources and where they get their supply of helium and certain kind of LNG related gases from. And this is a serious shortage problem that they are trying to solve. The person who I know who works at Micron was telling me this, so that's like quite a solid first-hand source. That's quite a solid first-hand source. On top of that, there is the fact that global manufacturing will inevitably reduce or increase in costs, which will drive rent prices further up, causing only the really rich and powerful to really be able to afford it, which makes shortages for us consumers worse. And that's basically boils down to things like power cost. I mean, a lot of the RAM manufacturing in the world comes from Korea, and Korea is really concerned about oil and natural gas and not having enough energy. And from what I've understand, Korea and Japan have started burning coal to reduce the usage of oil. And that just tells you how critical these oil shortages and the increase in energy prices are really going to be. But an increase in energy prices don't just make manufacturing RAM more expensive, it also makes the whole process more expensive. The shipment, the logistics, the flow of things are just heavily disrupted by this whole Strait of Hormuz being closed. So as a result, I strongly believe that, hey, the RAM shortage is not going to magically be fixed because TurboQuant made RAM usage 600% more effective in these AI models being trained and being used. It is still good news for the development of AI, for the development of local source decentralized AI for us who are trying to run it on home labs and home PCs. And it probably could help reduce the sheer demand pressure on RAM. But because of the other reasons I stated earlier, I feel like this impact is not as big as you think it, as a lot of influencers are trying to suggest that it might be. So yeah, I don't think the RAM shortage is over. But will it get better? Yeah, I think it will get better, but not necessarily just because of a thing like TurboQuant, though I believe with the success of TurboQuant, we will see a lot of similar competing methods and methodologies that try to achieve similar or even better results or build on top of it, which will help improve the situation. But that will take time and research and years of progress. But also the fact that, the Chinese really are heavily ramping up RAM production. From what I understand, the Chinese are, are not technologically advanced enough on the semicon RAM manufacturing side of things to, make the really high-end HBM RAM chips that these AI servers are heavily using. But they can make DDR5 RAM, which is what us plebeians and consumers use, and they are basically kicking into overdrive. And if we know anything about Chinese manufacturing, is that we know they're fast, they're really strong, and they're really capable of just getting things out ASAP, especially when there is a strong market pool and a strong market demand and a strong financial incentive. And so I think the savior, just like it was 6-8 months ago, for the AI RAM shortage, is Chinese manufacturing coming in to fill in the gaps on the consumer side of things. Because of the third reason I mentioned about the lack and scarcity of natural resources, while the supply might be elevated, while the supply issues might be elevated, the pricing issues of RAM will probably still remain in some form. But having some RAM to buy is still going to make the RAM cheaper than having no RAM at all to buy, which was what the shortage was really doing at the start. So that is my personal take on the matter, having read somewhat into it, having looked into it, having discussed it with people who know a thing or two in the industry. I don't think I'm fully correct. I also don't think I'm fully wrong. I'm pretty confident that most of my guesses and predictions and read on the sitch is correct. But if you disagree or you have things to add or you have technical corrections, please tell me in the comments. I am far from the most knowledgeable. If you want to see more kind of raw opinions, raw reviews, just pure honesty, nothing but an iPhone and a mic, please subscribe. That's what this channel is about. I think I'm just sick of seeing so many channels that are just overproduced and so great and perfect, but it's kind of soulless. I'm just really just trying to connect over this love and discussion of the tech industry and various things. And if you like that idea, please subscribe.